It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, in the past few days, Ukrainians have been subjected to some of the most intense bombardments of the 9-month-old war. Russian missiles and drones have rained down on Kyiv, Mykolaiv, Chernihiv, Cherkasy, Zhytomyr, Sumy, Kharkiv, Lviv, Poltava, and elsewhere, destroying or damaging homes and severely disrupting critical services. The impact of such attacks can only worsen during the coming winter months. As of 14 November, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 16,631 civilian casualties, 6,557 persons killed, and 10,074 injured since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The recent barrages will, alas, add to the horrific toll the war has already taken. I must say it again. Attacks targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international humanitarian law. The military dynamics on the ground continue to evolve. In the past week, the city of Kherson returned to Ukrainian government control. Heavy battles also continue in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Indeed, there is no end in sight to the war. As long as it continues, the risks of potentially catastrophic spillover remain all too real. Yesterday's incident in Poland near the Ukrainian border was a frightening reminder of the absolute need to prevent any further escalation. I wish to join the Secretary General in extending condolences to the families of the 2 Polish citizens killed in the incident. Mr. President, the ongoing bombardment of Ukraine has already damaged an estimated 40% of the country's power generation capacity. Kyiv has been hit hardest. Most parts of the capital are now without electricity for 12 hours a day. As the Ukrainian government focuses on repairing damaged infrastructure, the United Nations has made it a priority to ensure that the most vulnerable receive winter supplies and services. More than 185,000 people have already received essential basic winter supplies. Humanitarian partners are setting up heating points near the front lines. Some 525 generators were provided or are being distributed to priority institutions, including hospitals, collective centers, and clinics. Humanitarian access has resumed in the areas back under Ukrainian government control, including in Kherson. However, it is still extremely difficult to reach people in need in areas of the east and south under the control of the Russian military and across the front line. Mine contamination, particularly in areas close to the front or where control has recently shifted, are putting more lives at risk, impeding the movement of civilians and hampering humanitarian efforts. I remind the parties that international humanitarian law requires them to facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for all civilians in need. Mr. President, the allegations of atrocities and human rights violations in Ukraine during this war are extensive. Today, I'd like to highlight grave concerns about the rights, safety, and security of the youngest Ukrainians. Over 400 children have been killed, and many more have been injured, lost their family members, or been forced to leave their homes. According to the government portal, Children of War, 279 children were considered missing as of 12 November. There are also disturbing reports of forced transfers of children, including of some under institutionalized care, to Russian-occupied territory or to the Russian Federation. OHCHR has documented several individual cases, including of unaccompanied children, that appear to amount to deportations to the Russian Federation in violation of international humanitarian law. OHCHR also continues to document other types of human rights violations, including 57 verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence. 48 of these cases are attributable to Russian armed forces and affiliated groups. 9 are attributable to Ukrainian armed forces and law enforcement authorities. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine continues its work towards accountability for alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law, with ongoing investigations in and out of Ukraine. The commissioners are planning another visit to Ukraine before the end of the year. Another issue of concern is the conditions of prisoners of war. I welcome the continued prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine, including most recently on 11 November. I encourage the sides to continue releasing POWs. I call on the parties to ensure humane treatment of prisoners of war in line with their obligations under international law, in particular, the Third Geneva Convention. I also call on the Russian Federation to grant OHCHR and ICRC unimpeded access to detainees. Mr. President, the extension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative remains vital to help avert a food crisis for millions of people. More than 10 million metric tons of foodstuffs have now been moved under the initiative, reaching or on their way to some 40 countries. The impact of the initiative extends far beyond immediate ports of arrival, helping to lower global food prices for key food commodities around the world. The Secretary General has continued his engagement with all parties in support of the renewal and full implementation of the initiative. He has also emphasized his commitment to removing remaining obstacles to Russian food and fertilizer exports. These products are not under international sanctions, but suffer indirect impacts. It is important and critical to get them back to world markets. The sooner, the better. Mr. President, the risk of nuclear incident in the context of the open hostilities in Ukraine remains an unacceptable danger, and I wish to echo the serious concerns expressed by numerous member states in this regard. The IAEA Director General has recently briefed this Council on the organization's latest efforts, including ongoing discussions regarding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, as well as assessments of activities and materials at other sites in Ukraine. The IAEA has reported that, in the coming weeks, it will send nuclear safety and security missions to 3 more operating nuclear power plants, as well as to Chernobyl at the request of the Ukrainian government. I reiterate the imperative to avoid any military activity that could risk compromising the safety and security of any nuclear facility. Mr. President, since before the invasion of 24 February, the United Nations and many others in the global community warned of the consequences of a wider war in Ukraine, for Ukrainians, first of all, but also for much of the world. These fears have amply borne out. One significant casualty of the war has been the international collective security system we have all pledged to uphold. The damage to the structures built to resolve or manage tensions and conflict is significant, making it, in turn, even more difficult to chart a path out of the hostilities in Ukraine. There is only one way to stop the death, destruction, and division. The war must end, and it must end in line with international law and the UN Charter, as called for by the UN General Assembly. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. And I give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Undersecretary General DiCarlo, for your valuable briefing today. Colleagues, I want to start by noting the tragic explosion that killed 2 people in Poland near the Ukrainian border. We extend our deepest condolences to the loved ones of those Polish citizens who were killed. As President Biden told President Duda last night, we stand with Poland in this difficult moment and have offered our full support for and assistance with Poland's investigation to determine exactly what happened. We have complete confidence in the Polish government's investigation and appreciate the calm, careful, and measured response. While we still don't know all the facts, we do know one thing. This tragedy would never have happened but for Russia's needless invasion of Ukraine and its recent missile assaults against Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. The UN Charter is clear. Ukraine has every right to defend itself against this barrage. Defend its sovereignty, defend its territorial integrity. The more than 90 missiles that rained down on Kyiv and other targets in Ukraine have devastated civilian infrastructure. In fact, this may have been the widest scale missile attack since the beginning of the war. Now millions of Ukrainians are without heat or electricity. We extend our solidarity to the Ukrainian people for the fallout of this attack and our deepest condolences for those lives lost. This is a deliberate tactic by Putin. He seems to have decided that if he can't seize Ukraine by force, he will try to freeze the country into submission. It is hard to overstate how horrific these attacks are. When I was in Ukraine last week, I saw firsthand the tremendous suffering these kinds of attacks and this war has wrought on the Ukrainian people and Europe more broadly. I know we've all seen the photos of cratered playgrounds, bombed out hospitals, and destroyed homes across Ukraine. But no photograph can capture the real lives affected, the real people suffering the immense human toll of Russia's war against a fellow UN member state. I felt that toll when I spoke with a mother in Kyiv who had to hold her daughter's lifeless bloody hand after a Russian attack on her apartment building. Her daughter, in her mother's words, just wanted to go to school. I felt that toll when I met with a humanitarian aid worker who was detained and tortured by Russian forces. She was so traumatized that she could only share a portion of the horrors she experienced, unable to put the rest into words. I felt that toll when I met a 10-year-old named Melina, who lived in a facility where displaced families were gathered to prepare for a bitterly cold winter, a facility which itself had once been hit and damaged by Russian missiles. I was there to announce more humanitarian funding from the United States to provide supplies and support while Russia prepared to weaponize the winter. I made that announcement in the dark during a blackout caused by Russian attacks. Afterwards, I asked Melina what she would do when the war was over. And I could tell that this was something that she had given some thought to. She said simply, she wanted to see her best friend, who she had not seen since the start of the war. And I have to say, I wondered if she would someday see her friend again. Colleagues, when I met with President Zelensky, his message was simple. He seeks peace. He told me he seeks a just peace that is based on the UN Charter and its principles, which is what everyone in this council is here to uphold and defend. We cannot say the same for Russia. As Secretary Blinken has told this council, if Russia stops fighting this war today, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. It is Ukrainian civilians who are in danger. It is Ukrainian civilians whose electricity grids have been targeted, who aren't sure how they will keep warm throughout the winter. it is Ukrainian civilians who are suffering. There is one man sitting comfortably in Moscow who can put a stop to this brutal, horrific war right now, this second. But until he does, we must address not only the scale of the humanitarian and human rights crisis unfolding in Ukraine, but also the continued spillover effects of this needless war. Just look at the outsized harm done by Russia's exacerbation of the global food security crisis. Colleagues, if you're looking for a practical way to lower tensions and help those in need, it would be by supporting and securing an extension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. According to the UN's records, nearly 500 ships carrying over 10 million metric tons of grain and other food items have departed under this initiative. That's enough to feed tens of millions of people. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has helped stabilize food markets, with reports that prices have fallen to pre-war levels. 2/3 of the wheat exported under the initiative has gone to the global south, but the deadline for renewing the deal is fast approaching. When I was in Kyiv, I visited a granary and heard that farmers need this deal to be extended so they will have the confidence to plant their wheat and continue serving as a breadbasket to the developing world. I could hear the desperation in their voices, and I promised them that I would take their message back to the Security Council. Russia must extend this essential life-saving arrangement. Russia must allow these ships to keep feeding the world. And I call on our fellow council members to make the same calls with the same urgency to keep the deal alive. In the long run, the only way to ensure food supplies are not impacted further is for Russia to withdraw its troops, stop the atrocities, and end the war. But in the meantime, we're grateful for the efforts of Turkey and the UN in sustaining and expanding this life-saving initiative. And I hope sincerely that we can continue to strive with Ukraine in the driver's seat toward a just and lasting peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, USG DiCarlo, for your comprehensive update. Here we are with another meeting on Ukraine, and yet after 9 months of brutal war, we continue to deplore loss of innocent life, countless unnecessary fatalities, widespread human misery, massive destruction, food insecurity, and a world order shaken to its core. In a normal life, 9 months is the period humans need to bring a baby to life. Russia has used it to make a disaster of terrible proportions, including by making normal life impossible to all, including to babies born in Ukraine since the 24th of February. For what reason? For a dream that has turned into a nightmare, for a miscalculation that has become an obsession. Mr. President, what some have feared and others had anticipated happened yesterday. A missile landed in a farm in Poland, killing 2 people. It landed roughly at the same time as a barrage of Russian missiles attacked western Ukraine. A full investigation is underway, and we look forward to its conclusions. But this does not change anything to the core issue. For as long as this war goes, we will run the risk of spillover by accident or intention. This incident should be a stark reminder that those who engage in the path of unnecessary reckless escalation will bear the consequences. We know, and the world knows, that consequences of the war are not limited to Ukraine only. Moldova has already complained about the effect of Russian missiles fired close to its borders, and parts of its territory are experiencing power outages as a result of Russian missiles hitting Ukrainian cities and vital infrastructure. We present our condolences to the families of the victims and to the people of Poland and Ukraine. We reiterate our full and unwavering solidarity with Poland, just as with every other NATO member. Let's make it clear, this is not a war between Russia and NATO, nor is it between Russia and the West. It has never been, despite Kremlin's propaganda to justify its debacle. It is and remains a war of choice, a pure act of unprovoked aggression, and an attempt to grab territory. This war must end, not expand. And Russia started it, Russia must put an end to it, and this is long time past due. Mr. President, yesterday, President Zelensky proposed a 10-point peace plan at the G20 summit in Indonesia, demonstrating leadership again by making clear he is prepared for diplomacy to end the unjust and unjustified war. The plan includes a path to nuclear safety, food security, a special tribunal for war crimes, and a final peace treaty with Russia. The staggering response was, alas but not surprising, another wave of missiles, its biggest in a month, targeting again residential areas and power infrastructure in several regions of the country, with the aim to destroy essential utilities such as electricity, water, and gas infrastructure across Ukraine. As the winter gets colder, more than 7 million Ukrainians are left without power and the supply of electricity in a critical condition. In this case, there was no error. It looks like more terror. Unable to prevail on the ground, Russia has decided to weaponize everything, including weather now, with the intention to freeze an entire nation to submission. But it seems they fail to understand that in this fight, Ukraine has nothing more to lose. The heroic resistance of brave Ukrainians has clearly made it impossible for Russia to win, unable to advance, and incomprehensible to acclaim. Mr. President, Russia decided to withdraw its troops from Kherson. It was not the first of such sudden reversals. They did so early this year from the surroundings of Kyiv. No one, including in Russia, is buying anymore the camouflaged language. The so-called special operation cannot conceal the fiasco, and the retreat cannot hide the defeat. Only a few weeks ago, on 30 September, Kremlin proclaimed Kherson to be Russian forever. Now, a few weeks later, it just turned to what it should be, never. A wiser decision would be for Russia to come to senses, cease all hostilities, and unconditionally withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine. And let me reiterate once more that any annexation of territory by another state resulting from the threat or use of force is a violation of the principles of the UN Charter and international law and will not be accepted. Mr. President, the Russian Federation continues to violate and blatantly ignore international law. USG DiCarlo mentioned some key aspects of these violations. The use of missiles, drones, explosive weapons in populated areas are prohibited by international law, including by binding resolutions of this Council that Russia has voted for. Violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, enforced disappearance and arbitrary detention of civilians, torture and ill treatment of both civilians and prisoners. Cases of conflict-related sexual violence have been widespread and now are well documented. These gross violations will not go unpunished. Victims and their family members seek justice and accountability. Russia may continue to block the Council, but as we have seen repeatedly and convincingly, including last Monday, they will not manage to veto the decisions by the UNGA and other initiatives to seek and ensure reparations and accountability. Mr. President, we reiterate our strong support for the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We reiterate our call for its extension beyond 22nd November to keep this vital food supply line open to the rest of the world. Its impact is known and felt worldwide, and any other decision than extension would be a cynical punishment of those in dire need. Mr. President, let me conclude by reminding that the toll of the war is already frightening. With every day going on, the toll will be heavier for all, for Ukraine first, for everybody, including for Russia itself. In the course of the past 9 months, nothing has gone according to plan in Ukraine, for the simple reason that the Russian plan was wrong, the intention behind reprehensible, and the reality has proved disastrous. It's time to change course, silence the guns, pack and go home, talk peace, not war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, alors que les dirigeants du G20 se réunissaient pour défendre la paix, la Russie a démontré une fois de plus son absence de scrupules en lançant une nouvelle campagne de frappe contre les villes ukrainiennes, en ciblant des infrastructures civiles. La France condamne avec la plus grande fermeté ces frappes qui constituent des violations flagrantes du droit international. Elle réaffirme son soutien à l'Ukraine. J'exprime par ailleurs la solidarité de la France avec la Pologne et nos condoléances pour les victimes que le président Macron a exprimées hier soir au Premier ministre polonais. La Russie porte l'entière responsabilité de la guerre. Ce sont ces frappes massives contre l'Ukraine qui menacent la stabilité et la sécurité internationale et peuvent mener à une escalade involontaire. L'Ukraine ne fait qu'exercer son droit le plus strict à se défendre. Par cette agression, la Russie viole délibérément la Charte des Nations Unies et notamment le principe d'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine. Dès le 16 mars, la Cour internationale de justice a exigé la suspension des opérations militaires de la Russie. Bientôt 9 mois de guerre et les attaques contre les civils et les infrastructures civiles se poursuivent. La Russie vise désormais les centrales électriques et hydroélectriques et les réseaux de chauffage situés loin derrière la ligne de front, avec l'objectif assumé de briser la résistance d'un peuple qui lutte pour sa liberté. Parce qu'elle recule sur le terrain, la Russie cherche à plonger l'Ukraine dans le froid et le noir à l'approche de l'hiver. Cette stratégie est d'ores et déjà un échec. Elle n'entame en rien la résistance du peuple ukrainien. Elle renforce au contraire sa détermination. La libération de Kherson en est une nouvelle illustration. Monsieur le Président, plus la Russie s'obstine à faire durer cette guerre, plus elle aggrave les conséquences énergétiques, alimentaires et économiques de celle-ci. Nous avons entendu, au cours des dernières semaines, dans cette même salle, la Russie multiplier les accusations outrancières concernant la préparation d'une bombe sale par l'Ukraine. Les inspections de l'Agence internationale de l'énergie atomique qui ont été conduites à Kiev, Zhovti-Kodi et Dnipro, à la demande des autorités ukrainiennes, n'ont relevé aucune activité ou matière non déclarée. Nous avons désormais la confirmation que ces allégations étaient totalement infondées. La France salue la rapidité avec laquelle l'AIEA s'est rendue sur place et elle félicite l'Ukraine pour sa transparence. Monsieur le Président, la Russie n'hésite pas à instrumentaliser l'insécurité alimentaire et la malnutrition. Le sort de millions de personnes dépend de la prolongation des accords d'Istanbul. Après avoir d'abord suspendu pendant quelques jours sa participation à l'initiative sur les exportations de céréales en mer Noire, la Russie cherche désormais à monnayer son accord au renouvellement de celle-ci. Ce chantage est intolérable. Tout doit être mis en œuvre pour que les exportations de céréales ukrainiennes se poursuivent sans entrave. Nous appelons la Russie à ne pas faire obstacle au renouvellement des accords du 22 juillet. La France continuera d'appuyer les efforts du secrétaire général et de la Turquie en ce sens. Elle continuera également de se mobiliser avec ses partenaires européens dans le cadre des voies de solidarité qui ont permis l'exportation par voies fluviales et terrestres de près de 15 millions de tonnes de céréales et autres produits alimentaires. Je rappelle que l'Union européenne, les États-Unis et le Royaume-Uni ont publié le 14 novembre des lignes directrices visant à faciliter les exportations de produits alimentaires et d'engrais russes. La France a annoncé une contribution à hauteur de 7,5 millions d'euros pour financer l'acheminement par le Programme alimentaire mondial d'engrais vers l'Afrique. Monsieur le Président, la Russie ne pourra s'exonérer de sa responsabilité pour les crimes commis en Ukraine. Je salue l'adoption par l'Assemblée générale d'une résolution recommandant la création d'un registre des dommages subis par toutes les victimes ukrainiennes. La France salue le courage et la résistance du peuple ukrainien. Nous continuerons à nous tenir à ses côtés. La France organisera conjointement avec l'Ukraine le 13 décembre prochain une conférence de soutien à l'Ukraine. Elle visera à répondre à l'urgence et à augmenter la fourniture de l'aide internationale, qu'il s'agisse de matériel de première nécessité ou de la reconstruction d'infrastructures critiques, en particulier énergétiques. La France réitère son soutien indéfectible à la souveraineté et à l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine face à l'agression que mène la Russie. Nous restons déterminés à poursuivre notre soutien aux efforts de l'Ukraine pour défendre son territoire aussi longtemps qu'il le faudra. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Under-Secretary General DiCarlo, for your briefing. I'd like to start by offering our sympathies and condolences to the Polish people and to the families of those injured and killed in yesterday's incident. While we await the outcome of the investigation, we should be clear that this is a tragedy that indisputably stems from Russia's illegal and unjustified invasion and its inhumane assault on civilians across Ukraine. Yesterday, as President Zelensky was setting out to the G20 his 10-point plan for peace in Ukraine, Ukrainian civilians were facing the largest barrage of Russian missile and drone strikes since the first week of the war. We extend our condolences to the Ukrainian people and the families of those injured in these attacks. Russia's systematic attacks on Ukraine's critical national infrastructure have left millions without electricity, heating, water, medicine and food as temperatures start to drop below zero. And more than that, today we've heard again from the UN detailed reports of civilian deaths, sexual violence, and forced deportation of children. Russia is knowingly trying to gain military advantage by creating desperation. Attacks of this kind may violate international humanitarian law and are in any event deeply inhumane. President, on Monday, the General Assembly adopted a resolution on an international mechanism for reparations for damage, loss, and injury arising from Russia's internationally wrongful acts against Ukraine. This was an important first step towards justice for Ukraine. President, we are in no doubt that Ukraine will prevail in the face of Russia's aggression. The liberation of Kherson shows the strength, courage, and determination of the Ukrainian people to defend their right to sovereign equality and territorial integrity guaranteed under the UN Charter, and the UK will continue to stand by the Ukrainian people. But while the war is ongoing, we must continue also to manage its wider effects as best we can. That is why we strongly support the Black Sea Grain Initiative. It has been vital in helping alleviate the serious risks of food insecurity in the world, and we strongly support the UN in the efforts to renew it. President, fundamentally, this war is the result of unilateral action on the part of the Russian Federation. The path forward is therefore simple. Russia needs to cease hostilities, withdraw from within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, and commit to a path of dialogue. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, the United Arab Emirates extends its heartfelt condolences to Poland for the 2 civilians killed in yesterday's incident. The news of missiles hitting Polish territory and the increases in strikes across Ukraine seemed to signal the frightening escalation many of us have talked about in this very room. It perfectly demonstrated the fact that as the fighting continues, each day becomes a gamble in which there cannot be any winners. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is a source of profound concern. With winter's onset, 40% of the country's power system is reportedly damaged and 30% of its power stations are destroyed, potentially compounding the humanitarian crisis with a lack of heating. Around the world, governments continue to warn of the war's consequences on the global food supply, most recently at the G20 summit in Indonesia. In addition to the export of grains, the supply of ammonia and fertilizers, which are crucial to ensure adequate crop yields for next year's harvest, are also a priority. As the Secretary General has said, we cannot let this year's crisis of affordability become next year's crisis of availability. We join the call to renew the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and we urge the stakeholders to reach a solution that ensures the extension of these agreements, a critical breakthrough for which we are grateful to the UN and Turkey. Similarly, we commend OCHA and the other humanitarian actors for their tireless efforts to provide Ukrainian civilians with essential supplies, including the recent convoys to southern Ukraine. As humanitarian assistance and efforts to renew the grain initiative continue, we must acknowledge that this is not enough. Only a sustainable and peaceful resolution of the war will put an end to the suffering it has caused. We are encouraged by the recent public statements discussing the contours of a possible peace agreement. This Council must play its part to support any efforts at talks, and we must focus on measures that can bring the sides together rather than further apart. Mr. President, last month marked the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Back then, pragmatic and inventive diplomacy brought the world back from the brink. Public statements which counseled calm and restraint in response to the news from Poland and which emphasized the need to establish facts on the ground helped avoid further escalation within the last 24 hours. But the overall episode was an unnerving warning of the risks inherent in the continuation of the war. This cannot be the new normal. Too much is at stake, not least of which for Ukraine. We recall here the statement that came out of the G20. We must uphold international law and the multilateral system, defend the UN Charter, and adhere to international humanitarian law, beginning with urgently needed de-escalation. We must encourage confidence-building measures and open channels of communication to end this conflict and to ensure that today's era is not an era of war. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Gracias, presidente. Agradecemos a la secretaria general adjunta, Rosemary DiCarlo, por su presentación. Los misiles que cayeron ayer en Polonia, más allá de su origen o intencionalidad, son motivo de gran preocupación. Nuestras condolencias a los familiares de las víctimas que resultaron de estos hechos tan lamentables. El incidente nos recuerda que los riesgos de una expansión del conflicto son reales y nos obliga a redoblar esfuerzos para encontrar pronto una salida diplomática que ponga fin al sufrimiento de la población civil en toda la región. Me referiré a 4 puntos. En primer lugar, destaco la situación humanitaria. Al daño acumulado durante los 9 meses que lleva el conflicto, se suman ahora la destrucción de infraestructura eléctrica y el inicio del invierno. La falta de electricidad compromete muchos otros servicios básicos. Señalo solo uno de ellos, el del abastecimiento de agua. Todo ello pone en un riesgo aún mayor la vida y la salud de millones de civiles. De continuar el deterioro en las condiciones de vida, se generará una nueva ola de desplazamientos en un momento en que las comunidades de acogida están ya al límite de sus capacidades. Las cifras son muy elocuentes. 7.8 millones de ucranianos han tenido que abandonar su país, mientras que otros 6 millones se encuentran internamente desplazados. En este contexto, la ayuda humanitaria se vuelve indispensable para la sobrevivencia, sobre todo de la población más vulnerable. Reiteramos nuestro llamado a permitir el acceso irrestricto a toda la población civil, incluidos los espacios ocupados, los oblasts, donde se ha decretado ley marcial. Aunque menos evidente, el conflicto ha tenido también graves consecuencias sobre la salud mental de la población. Los más de 400 niños muertos y los otros 279 desaparecidos son una muestra, sí, pero una muestra muy dramática del dolor que esta guerra está causando. México reitera la importancia de incluir servicios de apoyo psicosocial en las estrategias de respuesta humanitaria. Las secuelas sobre la salud mental no terminarán cuando finalice el conflicto, por lo que será imprescindible desarrollar una estrategia de largo plazo para hacer frente a esta dimensión del conflicto, una dimensión tan silenciosa como dolorosa. En segundo lugar, mencionaré el tema de la seguridad nuclear. La situación en torno a la planta nuclear de Zaporizhia sigue siendo motivo de preocupación. Reiteramos el llamado a establecer una zona de protección y seguridad en torno a la planta tal y como lo ha planteado el Organismo Internacional de Energía Atómica. México reconoce el trabajo del OEA, en particular para la verificación de 3 sitios sobre los cuales una de las partes tenía dudas en relación a las actividades que ahí se llevan a cabo. Tomamos nota de que el OEA concluyó que no hay evidencia de actividad nuclear o materiales no declarados. Seguiremos con atención los resultados de las visitas a otras plantas nucleares, incluida Chernobyl, en las próximas semanas. Si bien es indudable que la situación en la planta de Zaporizhia es crítica, conviene subrayar que durante un conflicto como el que nos ocupa, todas las instalaciones nucleares pueden convertirse en una catástrofe para la población y para el medio ambiente. En tercer lugar, quisiera referirme a la iniciativa de granos del Mar Negro, la cual, como aquí se ha dicho, ha sido fundamental para coadyuvar a mitigar la inseguridad alimentaria que afecta principalmente a países en desarrollo. Por ello es fundamental que continúe y que a su vez se implemente plenamente el acuerdo suscrito para facilitar el acceso a los mercados globales de productos alimentarios y fertilizantes rusos, incluido el amoníaco. Reconocemos los esfuerzos del secretario general para eliminar la inmensa gama de obstáculos a los que se enfrentan las exportaciones de dichos productos. Los acuerdos han sido una señal de esperanza para quienes creemos en el diálogo y en la diplomacia como vías para encontrar la solución al conflicto, a pesar de las múltiples desavenencias que parecieran a veces casi insuperables. Finalmente, presidente, señalaría que es fundamental avanzar en las investigaciones internacionales para asegurar la rendición de cuentas. Quienes hayan cometido crímenes en este conflicto deberán responder ante la justicia. La comunidad internacional le debe esto, por lo menos esto, a las víctimas y a sus familiares. Por ello, seguiremos con atención los trabajos que al respecto realiza la Corte Penal Internacional. Concluyo reiterando que México insiste en la conveniencia de explorar nuevas fórmulas que favorezcan la mediación y el diálogo para poner fin a esta guerra. Presidente, México reitera su apoyo a la soberanía, la independencia y la integridad territorial de Ucrania. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. And the briefing we have had today makes it clear that the war in Ukraine continues to cause extreme suffering to civilians far beyond what is acceptable under international law and international humanitarian law. We offer our condolences to all the families and communities that have lost loved ones to this war, including in the incident that happened yesterday in Poland. We pray for the speedy recovery of those injured and traumatized. We are gravely concerned by the persistent targeting of civilians and objects indispensable to their survival, including residential homes, health facilities, shelters, as well as energy and water infrastructure. This war that follows on a long-term political conflict is a violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and constitutes a breach of the fundamental principles of the UN Charter. The military alliances forming on either side are giving the war a regional and global footprint. The risk of its escalation to the use of weapons of mass destruction suggests the ultimate inability of a clear military victory at a cost that is acceptable to humanity. There is no long-term military solution. All that a continuation of the war will do is delay negotiations while even greater damage is happening. Kenya, therefore, once again, calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Negotiations will not be easy, especially if they are to be fully in line with the UN Charter in protecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. But they can succeed, as others have in Europe's volatile history. It will also be critical that they be accompanied or followed by a broader settlement that stabilizes what is now a profoundly compromised European security order. Mr. President, the world needs peace in Ukraine and in Europe. The humanitarian cost to the people of Ukraine are joined by those of millions around the world. We continue to applaud the humanitarian-inspired and UN-facilitated Black Sea Grain Initiative. We strongly urge for its renewal on permanent terms. The flow of grains and fertilizers from Ukraine over the Black Sea and also from the Russian Federation over the land corridors must be assured. Unfortunately, there are still unilateral blockages of food and fertilizer products despite the frequent assurances to the contrary. We therefore urge the Secretary General to urgently undertake an assessment of official and unofficial blockages and to make that report available to the Security Council. The same should be done by humanitarian organizations such as the World Food Programme. We also encourage regional organizations such as the European Union and the African Union to review and report on the experiences of their member states in ensuring unimpeded exports of Ukrainian and Russian food and fertilizer to world markets. Our region, the Horn of Africa, is experiencing the worst drought in decades. We cannot afford to pay for exceedingly expensive fertilizer if we are to avoid a worse food insecurity situation in the coming year. We must move from political assurances of the open flow of these vital goods and transparently and rigorously assess and report the facts on the ground. Millions of lives depend on this august house, going beyond rhetoric and guaranteeing practical effects. Mr. President, the crisis presents an opportunity. Africa is the most food insecure region in the world, yet it has the largest amount of underused arable land with a population that is still mostly rural-based. Too many African families use a disproportionate part of their incomes on purchasing food. It is a major component of the political instability that sadly leads to the continent having the most conflict situations being handled by the Security Council. We now have a historic opportunity to put in place financial risk mitigation, technology transfers and investments to transform agricultural productivity on the continent. While we commend the humanitarian efforts being made to offer relief, our target must be sufficient production. The efficacy of the continent's cooperation agreements with other regions and major powers should be judged by the extent to which they lead to a surge in Africa's production of food and fertilizer, so that it is never again as vulnerable as it is today. Mr. President, the more protracted this war is, the more its malign effects will spread. As more citizens suffer in more countries, their political demands may lead to less worldwide solidarity with the suffering people of Ukraine. Every country calling for this solidarity must look into its conduct when it comes to enabling the free flow of food and fertilizer products and act with compassion and empathy for those who need them around the world. In closing, Kenya once again reiterates its respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of India.
Mr. President, let me begin by thanking Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing and update of the situation in Ukraine. India continues to remain concerned about the situation in Ukraine, including the targeting of civilian infrastructure and the death of civilians. Since the beginning of the conflict, India has consistently called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and for an end to the violence. We've called upon both sides to return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue and have also expressed our support for all diplomatic efforts to end the conflict. We thus stand ready to support all efforts aimed at de-escalation. India's Prime Minister has said unequivocally that this cannot be an era of war. We hope that the international community will continue to respond positively to the call for humanitarian assistance. India has so far dispatched 12 consignments of humanitarian aid to Ukraine and stands ready to do more. Mr. President, I will also state that the impact of the Ukraine conflict has not just been limited to Europe. The Global South is especially facing serious economic consequences. We are also seeing growing concerns on energy and food security from the conflict that follow the severe stress created by 2 years of the COVID pandemic. Insofar as specific initiatives pertaining to issues like food, grains, and fertilizer shipments are concerned, we very much hope that the UN-facilitated Black Sea grain and fertilizer package deal will be renewed in coming days, and that this will be implemented by all parties earnestly in all its aspects. I wish to assure this Council, Mr. President, that India's approach to the Ukraine conflict will continue to be people-centric. We are providing both humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to some of our neighbors in the Global South under economic distress. In closing, may I reiterate that the global order is anchored on the principles of the UN Charter, international law, and respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of India for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie Madame Rosemary DiCarlo pour son exposé édifiant. Monsieur le Président, la guerre en Ukraine va bientôt entrer dans son 9e mois et les signaux d'une désescalade et d'une cessation des combats ne semblent pas se profiler à l'horizon. Nous saluons la reprise des exportations dans le cadre de l'accord sur les céréales après une brève suspension. La mise en œuvre de l'accord doit se faire sur la base d'un engagement ferme et la bonne foi de toutes les parties. Je voudrais d'ailleurs me faire l'écho de l'appel lancé par le secrétaire général en vue du renouvellement de cet accord important et de sa mise en œuvre pleine et équilibrée. La reprise de l'accord sur les céréales est un signal qui révèle que même en temps de guerre, les canaux du dialogue et de la diplomatie restent ouverts. Monsieur le Président, la guerre en Ukraine continue d'entraîner de nombreuses conséquences humanitaires à la faveur des déplacements massifs des personnes qui fuient les lieux de combat, de nombreuses victimes civiles et des pertes matérielles dont les coûts sont incalculables. L'insécurité persistante et la perturbation des chaînes d'approvisionnement ont précipité de nombreuses populations dans la faim et la détresse. Les premières victimes sont les personnes vulnérables, notamment les femmes et les enfants, souvent victimes de violences sexuelles, à la traite des personnes et à différentes atteintes aux droits humains fondamentaux. Nous appelons une fois de plus les parties belligérantes à respecter le droit international humanitaire et à s'abstenir d'infliger des souffrances aux civils. Les infrastructures civiles, y compris les sites nucléaires civils, ne doivent pas être l'objet d'attaques et l'aide humanitaire doit se déployer sans entrave. Mon pays réitère son opposition à l'utilisation de toute arme de destruction massive. Nous appelons au dialogue et à des négociations de bonne foi en vue de parvenir à un cessez-le-feu. Le Gabon soutient et continuera de soutenir tous les efforts visant à la recherche d'une solution diplomatique qui puisse garantir la coexistence pacifique entre toutes les parties. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, President, and thank you, USG DiCarlo, for your briefing. I also want to open by expressing our condolences to the Polish people following the explosion in the small border town of Bergedorf yesterday, which killed 2 people. We extend our deepest sympathies to the families of those killed and injured. We also fully support Poland's investigation of the incident, and we stand in full solidarity with Poland. President, Russia has launched hundreds of drone and missile strikes in recent weeks in Ukraine with the apparent aim of terrorising and demoralising the civilian population. Yesterday, Russia scaled up its strikes with further attacks in Kyiv and across Ukraine. While Russia seeks to escalate the war, millions of people across Ukraine are tonight grappling with the prospect of a dark and freezing winter without reliable access to water, heat, electricity and other basic services. The most vulnerable in Ukrainian society, the internally displaced, children and the elderly, face a particularly precarious future. Women, already disproportionately impacted by the war, are once again put in unsafe and precarious situations. That this may be the intended result of recent Russian attacks on Ukraine's cities and infrastructure is simply unconscionable. This includes efforts to remove Zaporizhia from the Ukrainian grid and attacks on other Ukrainian nuclear facilities. This utter disregard for nuclear safety carries the strong risk of a nuclear incident with terrible consequences for Ukraine, Russia and the wider region. We stress the importance of the 7 pillars of nuclear safety and security and their applicability in armed conflict as set out by the IAEA Director General. We condemn these heinous attacks in the strongest possible terms. Attacks intentionally directed against civilians and civilian objects are war crimes, and those responsible for such attacks must be held to account. Mr. President, the people of Ukraine have shown remarkable resolve and determination in the face of brutal adversity. Ireland stands with them today, as always. We are very concerned by reports of heavy fighting in the east, where living conditions for the civilian population are increasingly dire and where Russian forces continue to attack, particularly around the city of Bakhmut and other towns in the region. In the south, we cautiously welcome the liberation of the city of Kherson and note the decision of the Russian leadership to withdraw to the eastern bank of the Dnipro River. We recall that parties to the conflict must comply with international humanitarian law. This includes the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. There must also be full, safe and unhindered humanitarian access to civilians in need, including those who choose to remain or who are unable to leave. Those who seek to leave and those who are forced to leave must be allowed to do so safely and be allowed to leave for destinations of their own choosing. We note that thousands of civilians were reportedly evacuated by the Russian army before its withdrawal from Kherson. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have been moved from Russian-occupied territories. We recall that the transfer or deportation of civilians by an occupying power from occupied territory can constitute a war crime. Refugees, internally displaced and stateless persons are particularly at risk of exploitation, with attacks and abductions that lead to trafficking. Women and children face particular danger in this regard and must be protected from harm. Conflict-related sexual violence is never acceptable and, again, may amount to war crimes. Mr. President, the reverberations of this war continue to be felt far beyond Ukraine's borders, with unequal and disproportionate impacts on developing countries. The Black Sea Grain Initiative plays an important role in alleviating global food insecurity, and it should continue to do so in the months ahead. We are grateful for the efforts of the UN and Turkey to facilitate Russia's resumed participation in the agreement. We urge all sides to maintain engagement in good faith and continue this important initiative. Mr. President, we have set out many of these concerns on many previous occasions at this table, and I fear we will do so again. But as my Minister for Foreign Affairs said earlier today, Ireland will make no apology for being on the side of international law, the UN Charter, and on the side of Ukraine and its people. Russia should end its illegal war of aggression, stop killing innocent civilians, and shelling of infrastructure with immediate effect. It is never too late for dialogue and diplomacy. We therefore renew our call on Russia to immediately cease hostilities, withdraw its forces, and commit to resolving all outstanding issues peacefully and in line with the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing. Brazil shares the concerns regarding the worsening humanitarian situation in Ukraine and the impact of the conflict on food security in other regions. Since the start of hostilities, we have advocated for the parties to engage in negotiations for a ceasefire and a peaceful solution to their differences. The Black Sea Initiative, which has already enabled exports of more than 10 million metric tons of grain, has been an important step. Brazil welcomes the decision of the Russian Federation to reconsider the suspension of its participation following the incidents of 29 October. While the conflict in Ukraine is not the only cause of the food insecurity we now face, the continuation of grain and fertilizer exports through Black Sea ports helps stabilize prices and prevent shortages. Fragilities in global food supply, however, stem from systemic actions over past decades that have hindered the development of the agricultural sector throughout the developing world, in particular in Africa. Among these, we must recognize the deleterious impact of massive agricultural subsidies and distorting tariff and non-tariff barriers that hold back agricultural production in developing countries. We renew our support for the mediation efforts of the Secretary General and the Republic of Turkey. We encourage the parties to engage in the immediate extension of the grain initiative, which we see as a necessary decision and an important confidence-building measure. Mr. President, the approach of winter finds Ukrainian cities in an alarming situation. The destruction of civil infrastructure, particularly in the energy sector, exposes millions of families to life-threatening conditions. Brazil strongly condemns the attacks against residential areas and civilian facilities, for which there is no justification. We urge all parties to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and to adopt practical measures to minimize civilian injuries and damages on the ground. At this challenging time, the international community needs to stand together in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Since March, contributions of food and medical supplies have been shipped from our country to Ukraine. In the coming weeks, Brazil will send 24 additional tons of rice donated by the private sector. The Brazilian government has also simplified entry requirements in order to facilitate the reception of refugees. It is encouraging to see that this wave of solidarity is observed in dozens of countries. We urge governments and the private sector to engage in similar initiatives which have never been more urgent since the beginning of the conflict. Mr. President, finally, we renew the call for the parties to return to the negotiating table without delay. We encourage other members to explore ways to foster dialogue. There is no more urgent task facing the United Nations than the search for an immediate ceasefire without preconditions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
谢谢主席先生。主席先生，乌克兰危机呈现长期化、扩大化、复杂化态势，让当前高度紧张的国际局势进一步承压，给世界带来更大不确定性，不符合任何一方利益。无论存在多少困难挑战，国际社会都要努力寻求共识，找到合作空间，为推动局势缓和降温，尽快重启外交谈判，减缓危及外溢影响，发挥建设性、负责任的作用。当前形势下，中方认为国际社会应继续沿着以下方向做出努力：一是共同支持危机和平解决。冲突战争没有赢家，对话谈判是解决乌克兰危机的唯一可行出路。只要能够谈起来，就有实现和平的希望。中方注意到俄罗斯近日多次表示愿意开展对话，希望有关各方能够相向而行，做出积极回应，尽快开展直接接触，为重启谈判创造条件。复杂问题没有简单的解决办法，各方要在照顾彼此合理安全关切的基础上，探讨构建均衡、有效、可持续的欧洲安全框架，从根本上解决危机背后的安全次质，实现欧洲大陆的和平稳定。希望美国、北约同俄罗斯就此开展全面对话。中方将继续以自己的方式发挥建设性作用。关于媒体报道称有导弹落在波兰东部边境村庄并造成人员伤亡，中方呼吁所有有关方保持冷静克制，避免误解误判，防止局势进一步升级。二是共同防止核风险。核安全、核保障、核安保监督问题事关乌克兰和周边地区公众健康和环境安全，不容试错。有关各方应当保持克制、谨慎行事，严格遵守核安全公约等国际法，确保乌克兰境内核设施和材料的安全，全力避免任何可能出现的核风险。中方支持国际原子能机构根据授权履行职责，在核安全问题上发挥积极作用。中方一贯主张，核战争打不赢，也打不得。我们注意到俄罗斯近日发表声明， 重申今年1月5合国领导人关于防止核战争和避免军备竞赛的联合声明有关内容。国际社会应当共同维护全球战略稳定，全力避免大国对抗，倡导核武器用不得，核战争打不得，防止亚欧大陆出现核危机。3是共同改善人道主义局势。中方对乌克兰人道局势持续恶化深感担忧，对乌克兰和周边地区人民遭遇的困难感同身受。我们呼吁有关各方认真遵守国际人道法，全力避免针对平民和民用设施的袭击，最大限度减少平民伤亡和对民众基本生活的影响，最大限度防止出现更大规模的人道主义危机。这个冬天对有关国家和周边地区受影响的民众来说将十分难熬。国际社会和人道机构应当继续加大人道救援力度，帮助乌克兰和周边地区疏解人道压力，改善人道状况，确保所有难民、流离失所者等有需要的民众都能得到妥善安置，平安越冬。4是共同减缓危机的外溢影响。黑海粮食外运倡议为缓解全球粮食危机做出了积极的贡献。中方欢迎各方坚持人道，着眼大局，恢复倡议的执行，也呼吁各方保持合作，继续对话，就倡议延期问题达成妥善的方案。中方支持联合国秘书长及其团队继续为解决俄罗斯粮食化肥出口困难发挥协调作用，呼吁相关当事方采取有力措施，消除制裁带来的负面影响，管控好乌克兰危机对全球能源、粮食、金融等领域造成的巨大冲击，是国际社会面临的紧迫任务。全方位、无差别制裁干扰全球产业链、供应链，破坏全球经济复苏势头，损害发展中国家经济财政稳定，应当立即予以纠正。主席先生，当今世界正经历100年未有之大变局，乌克兰危机及其外溢影响是这一变局的典型缩影，凸显了人类发展面临的重大挑战。世界怎么了？我们怎么办？这是各国共同面临的时代之问。在刚刚结束的20国集团领导人峰会上，习近平主席站在人类前途命运的高度，秉持历史和全球视野，提出一系列倡议主张，对应对当前全球挑战具有重要引领和指导意义。中方呼吁各国树立人类命运共同体意识，倡导和平、发展、合作、共赢，以团结代替分裂，以合作代替对抗，以包容代替排他。各国应坚持同舟共济，共度难关，共创未来。中方坚决反对以意识形态划线，反对冷战思维、集团政治和阵营对抗，反对搞以邻为壑、小院高墙和封闭排他的小圈子，反对将经济民生问题政治化、工具化和武器化。中方愿同世界各国一道，继续为应对全球性挑战、构建人类命运共同体做出不懈的努力。谢谢你，主席先生。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. USG DiCarlo, thank you for your very useful briefing. Yesterday, the Russian army inflicted massive waves of missile strikes on Ukraine, with civilians being killed. And in Poland, we saw an explosion resulting in the tragic loss of Polish lives. We are in close contact with our allies and partners and support the ongoing investigation. What we do know, however, is that this would not have happened had it not been for Russia's illegal war on Ukraine. One only needs to look at Kherson to see further evidence of their brutal campaign against civilians. We see in the wake of Russia's forced retreat, atrocities and destruction. They did what they could to make the situation as difficult as possible for the civilian population, destroying water, heat and electricity supplies. And they continue these tactics across the country. With winter approaching, the number of casualties and displaced persons could accelerate. Children, the elderly, and other people in highly vulnerable situations are particularly at risk. We call for safe, rapid, and unimpeded access for humanitarian organizations to all people in need, including access to prisoners of war. We commend the UN, International Committee of the Red Cross, and other humanitarian organizations for staying and delivering a principled humanitarian response under very challenging circumstances, and also their courageous and committed Ukrainian responders. We reiterate also our demand that all civilians must be protected. International humanitarian law and international human rights law must be fully respected and implemented. International law applies to all nations. It is not optional. President, the suffering and the atrocity committed by Russian armed forces have shocked the whole world. The consequences are felt globally. Russia's war of aggression is causing a refugee tragedy with a regional impact and is destabilizing financial markets, supply chains, and disrupting global energy security. The world's most vulnerable people and countries depend on a steady supply of food from Ukraine and Russia to global markets. It is essential to keep a transportation line open for the exports of grain-related foodstuff and fertilizers, including ammonia. Considering the dire global consequences, we trust the parties will stay committed to the Black Sea grain deal and that these life-saving shipments will continue. President, Russia's war of aggression demonstrates their disregard for the core principles of our organization and the suffering of millions of people in the wake of this war. As members of the Security Council, it is our duty to set a different course. As the Secretary General has emphasized, we have the values and principles necessary to chart this course. They are already enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. When the time comes, we will stand firmly with the Secretary General in efforts to build and sustain peace in Ukraine. We will work actively to ensure that this Council remains vigilant of the situation in Ukraine and able to address the host of other conflicts on its agenda. Let me end by repeating something we have said numerous times before, and yet it cannot be said often enough. Through its aggression and actions, the Russian Federation is acting with blatant disregard to international law. Russia must immediately heed the ruling of the ICJ and the calls of these United Nations to suspend its military operation within Ukraine's internationally recognized border and stop the senseless bloodshed and global suffering. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, мы весьма признательны нашим албанским и американским коллегам за инициативу провести сегодняшнее заседание. Правда, запросили они его еще на прошлой неделе, даже не сформулировав тему, проявив, как мы теперь видим, удивительную прозорливость. Если бы заседание не было назначено, его бы пришлось бы созвать для обсуждения попыток Украины и Польши спровоцировать прямое столкновение России и НАТО. Сделанные руководством этих двух государств абсолютно безответственные заявления по-другому воспринимать невозможно. Вот, например, заявление господина Зеленского, цитирую: «Мы должны указать террористу на его место. Чем больше Россия чувствует безнаказанность, тем больше угроз будет для каждого, кто находится в зоне досягаемости российских ракет. Ракетный удар по территории НАТО – это российский ракетный удар против коллективной безопасности. Это крайне серьезная эскалация. Мы должны действовать». Конец цитаты. Далее он принес соболезнования Польше в связи с гибелью людей в результате российской ракетной атаки, указав при этом, цитирую: «Россия убивает везде, куда может дотянуться». Конец цитаты. Обращаю внимание коллег, подобные заявления делает человек, который не может не обладать информацией о том, что на территорию Польши залетели именно украинские ракеты, выпущенные системой ПВО. А значит, это не просто преднамеренная дезинформация, но и сознательная попытка вовлечь НАТО, ведущую войну по доверенности с Россией на Украине, в прямое столкновение с нашей страной. Ненамного дальше ушли и русофобские власти Польши, с самого начала безапелляционно утверждавшие, что подверглись российской атаке. В МИД этой страны среди ночи был вызван российский посол, которому был заявлен решительный процесс. И это, несмотря на то, что опубликованные в соцсетях по горячим следам фотографии не оставляют никаких сомнений в том, что в Польшу залетели ракеты украинской ПВО. Собственно, это уже теперь прямым текстом подтвердили даже в НАТО и в целом на Западе. Если бы не это, то все эти факты от общественности, разумеется, скрыли бы, продвигая утверждение о виновности России. Но отрицать очевидное очень сложно. Так же, как в истории с ракетным ударом в ВСУ по Краматорску 8 апреля, который пытались выдать за преступление России. Но фотографии оказавшихся на месте свидетелей сорвали эту преднамеренную бесчеловечную провокацию. Наши бывшие западные партнеры теперь о ней не вспоминают, а киевский режим с тех пор ввел наказание для всех, кто публикует в соцсетях материалы с последствиями каких-либо военных ударов. Ведь таким образом украинские граждане могут невольно сорвать провокации своих властей. Возвращаясь к трагическому инциденту, не могу не отметить, что у украинской ПВО уже давно устойчивая дурная слава. Как минимум с того момента, когда в октябре 2001 года над Черным морем в ходе военных учений был сбит российский гражданский самолет, летевший из Тель-Авива в Новосибирск. Тогда погибли 78 человек. Многие вспоминали об этой трагедии в 2014 году, когда над Донбассом был сбит малайзийский Боинг. Но так называемые международные расследователи, в число которых вошла и Украина, версию с ответственностью Киева за эту катастрофу не рассматривали в принципе. А на протяжении последних месяцев мы регулярно видим кадры с последствиями попадания украинской ПВО по жилым домам, за которыми они эти системы и прятали в различных городах. Их неуклюже пытаются выдать за последствия российских ударов, наносимых высокоточным оружием по военным объектам и критической инфраструктуре, и умалчивая при этом, что в случае попадания такого оружия от жилых домов не осталось бы и следа. Уважаемые коллеги, нас давно уже перестали удивлять ваши попытки при любых обстоятельствах, вопреки фактам и здравому смыслу, во всем винить Россию. Вот и сегодня, несмотря на очевидную подоплеку украинско-польской провокации, многие представители западных стран высказывались в том духе, что даже если ракеты запускала Украина, виновата все равно Россия, разрушающая критическую инфраструктуру. Ущербность этой логики проявляется во всей красе применительно к безответственным обстрелам Запорожской атомной электростанции, за которыми, как все здесь прекрасно понимают, стоит Украина. Некоторые из вас повторили свою излюбленную лукавую мантру. Если бы не Россия, мы бы не оказались там, где оказались. Хочу в очередной раз напомнить вам, мы бы не оказались там, где оказались, если бы в Киеве в 2014 году при прямом участии ряда западных стран не произошел кровавый антиконституционный переворот, лидеры которого, взяв с первого дня курс на извращение истории и вытеснение русского языка, спровоцировали острый внутренний гражданский конфликт. И мы бы не обсуждали здесь сегодня то, что обсуждаем, если бы вы не потакали киевскому режиму в его нежелании выполнять минские договоренности и не покрывали бы его 8-летнюю войну против жителей Донбасса. В этом случае для защиты его населения нам не потребовалось бы начинать специальную военную операцию. А если бы вы не вмешивались и не поставляли бы Украине вооружение и боеприпасы, если бы вы побуждали украинское руководство к миру на реалистичных условиях, а не потакали бы его болезненным фантазиям о возможности победы над Россией, ради чего режим Зеленского бросает в бессмысленную мясорубку десятки тысяч своих солдат. Если бы не оставляли бы без реакции теракты украинских спецслужб против России, нам бы не пришлось наносить высокоточные удары по инфраструктуре. А раз вы поступаете так, как поступаете, а киевский режим еще и приписывает себе несуществующие военные заслуги, нам приходится реализовывать поставленные перед специальной военной операцией цели, ослабляя военный потенциал Украины, создаваемый прежде всего за счет безудержной накачки западными вооружениями. Мы уже привыкли к тому, что Украина находится вне критики. Любые преступления со стороны киевского режима априори игнорируются или приписываются России. Мы уже привыкли к гнусным фейкам в адрес России и ее вооруженных сил. Задам вам только один вопрос, риторический, разумеется. Кто-нибудь из вас хоть раз комментировал те репрессии и зверства, которые творят представители киевского режима на подконтрольных ему территориях в отношении мирных жителей? Какими эпитетами они их наделяют и каким издевательствам подвергают? Сейчас это как раз происходит в Херсоне, ранее происходило в других городах и населенных пунктах. Все это находится в открытом доступе. Отвечу за вас. Нет. Все это находится вне горизонта, вне вашего горизонта и вне зоны вашей избирательной совести. Поэтому, критикуя кого-либо, смотрите в зеркало. И не забудьте при этом еще и про то, как вы высокомерно отвергли предлагавшееся вам обсуждение вопросов европейской безопасности, цепляясь за священное право НАТО расширяться без оглядки на озабоченности других стран. Господин председатель, раз уж мы собрались, напомню и о вовлеченности стран НАТО в украинский конфликт. Они продолжают наводнять Украину вооружениями, направляя для работы с ними целые команды инструкторов и иностранных наемников. При этом военные США активно включились в планирование и фактическое руководство боевыми действиями, что недавно официально признал даже Пентагон. У нас нет сомнений, как используется западная военная техника, из которой ведутся прицельные удары по гражданским объектам. Только за последнюю неделю многократным артобстрелам, в том числе из РСЗО «Хаймерс», подверглись центральные районы и жилые массивы Донецкой, Ясиноватой, Стаханова, Сватова, других населенных пунктов и даже городов Белгородской области России. Продолжают наноситься удары по Каховской ГЭС, разрушение которой привело бы к крупнейшей гуманитарной катастрофе. У нас нет иллюзий, зачем это нужно Западу. Для него Украина в том числе полигон для испытаний различных видов оружия. что недавно признал и украинский министр обороны Резников, который заявил, что на Украине происходит соревнование различных западных систем вооружений. Господин председатель, крайнее удивление вызывают попытки наших западных коллег приписать себе заслуги в вывозе российских удобрений в развивающиеся страны через Всемирную продовольственную программу. Президент Франции Эммануэль Макрон объявил, что якобы канал их поставки удалось создать благодаря усилиям Франции и ВПП, употребив местоимение «мы». Схожие заявления услышали мы от западной делегации сегодня. Хотелось бы узнать, кто это «мы». Напомню, что речь идет об удобрениях, которые западными странами как раз удерживались на их территории и которые Россия сама предложила передать развивающимся странам. Запад, в частности Евросоюз, этому не только не помогал, он всячески этому противился, а теперь лицемерно пытается выставить себя спасителем развивающихся стран. Подчеркну еще раз, в Африку направятся российские удобрения, ранее замороженные в европейских портах из-за санкционной политики ЕС. Россия сама предложила направить их на безвозмездной основе нуждающимся странам. Именно это сейчас и происходит при посредничестве ВПП, которое мы сами же и платим за эти услуги. Господин председатель, было бы наивно полагать, что вся оказываемая Западом военная и финансовая поддержка Украине идет по назначению. Мы приводили немало свидетельств того, как значительная часть вооружений попадает в руки террористов и преступников, подпитывая конфликты по всему миру, а огромный объем ресурсов попросту разворовывается. Похоже, сейчас об этом наконец начали задумываться и страны-поставщики этой так называемой помощи. 7 ноября на Украину была направлена группа американских экспертов для проверки поставок вооружений Киеву. Как оказалось, США контролировали лишь 1/10 их часть или 22 тысячи единиц. Судьба остального направленного оружия неизвестна. Одновременно в результате банкротства крупнейшей американской криптобиржи FTX и буквального исчезновения ее миллиардных активов скрываются занимательные факты ее контактов с украинским правительством. Основатель и владелец биржи при этом является одним из крупнейших доноров Демократической партии США, которая играет ключевую роль в выделении средств Киеву. Нас эти схемы не удивляют, а вот американских налогоплательщиков, похоже, удивить могут. Робкие голоса благоразумия, звучащие в том числе и из Запада, тонут в агрессивном хоре тех, кто стремится любыми средствами продлить боевые действия и с помощью Украины нанести поражение России. Генеральный секретарь НАТО Столтенберг, например, заявил, что в Альянсе считают недопустимыми любые контакты, которые были бы направлены на урегулирование с учетом позиций и интересов России. А бывший спецпредставитель США по Украине Волкер в своей статье обусловил нормализацию отношений Запада с Россией нашим поражением, сменой руководства страны и пересмотром ее нынешних границ. Ответственность же за все свои прегрешения страны Запада пытаются переложить на Россию, да еще и используя для своих корыстных целей площадку нашей всемирной организации. Это наглядно проявилось и в этот понедельник, 14 ноября, в ходе дебатов спецсессии Генассамблеи. Западные инициаторы новой резолюции по так называемым репарациям не смогли даже в общих чертах объяснить, что за механизм по возмещению ущерба для Украины они намерены создать, вместо этого заставляя развивающиеся государства лишь подписаться под юридически ущербным политизированным текстом, направленным на незаконное узаконивание экспроприации чужих активов. Но на этот раз даже западная кампания запугивания, принуждения, шантажа явно дала сбой. Результаты голосования, на котором более половины государств-членов отказались поддержать новый антироссийский голос Запада, говорят сами за себя. Для большинства стран, включая и тех, кого вы заставили голосовать за этот проект, очевидно двойные стандарты наших западных коллег, их нежелание отвечать за свои собственные прегрешения, рабство, колониализм, военные вторжения, блокады и санкции, за их стремление противопоставить международному праву порядок, основанный на правилах, при котором правила формулируют они сами. Развивающийся мир в очередной раз убедился, что украинский кризис – лишь разменная монета в планах Запада, инструмент для наказания неугодных, подчинения зависимых и попыток удержать ускользающее глобальное доминирование в условиях формирующегося многополярного мира. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Ghana. I thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her comprehensive briefing and assessment of the security and humanitarian situations in Ukraine. At the outset, I reaffirm Ghana's complete commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We reiterate our support for all legitimate international efforts aimed at restoring Ukraine to a state of peace. Colleagues, the question of global food security is critical. During the last meeting of the Council on Ukraine, many delegations showed strong support for the continuity of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We are pleased that the Russian Federation has since reconsidered the suspension of its participation in the initiative, which has so far recorded more than 10 million metric tons of grain shipment across the world. The active leadership of the Secretary General and those of the government of Turkey have been key to the effective operationalization of the initiative, and we remain supportive of their efforts in this regard. As the 120-day initiative draws to a close on 19th November, we count on the good faith commitments of all stakeholders for the timely renewal of the grain deal. The almost 100 million people who suffer from high levels of food insecurity is an unacceptable reality. We urge that their conditions should be at the forefront of discussions to ensure unhindered global food supplies and the adoption of pragmatic measures to address impediments to the export of Russian fertilizers and agro-products. We must prevent the further worsening of food insecurity in the coming months. On the deteriorating security and humanitarian situations, Ghana remains deeply concerned by the intensified missile and drone attacks in several cities of Ukraine, including renewed attacks on Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Lviv yesterday. The unrelenting assault on Ukraine's already battered energy infrastructure amidst the upcoming winter season threaten the livelihoods and lives of many civilians. Many homes, schools, and medical facilities also have no heating or access to potable water. Typical of all conflict situations, the women, children, and vulnerable persons, most of whom are either displaced or sheltering in bunkers, have become the worst victims of this war. The attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure reveal the worst form of our common humanity and may constitute serious violations of international law. It departs from the accepted norms and the customary principles of conventional warfare codified in the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocol relating to the protection of victims of international armed conflict. Ghana therefore reiterates its call on the parties to bring their forces in accord with international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. We are gravely alarmed by the emerging reports of possible war crimes in the city of Kherson, and maintain the principled position that such claims, including human rights violations and conflict-related sexual violence, be submitted to thorough, transparent, and independent investigations. The Security Council, together with the international community, must work collectively to avoid impunity in Ukraine and secure justice for all victims of the war. We note with satisfaction the ongoing humanitarian efforts, including the distribution of cash, food and non-food items, medical outreach, and water, sanitation, and hygiene services. In commending the United Nations humanitarian agencies and partners for the life-saving support provided since the beginning of the war, we also stress the need for such efforts to be guided by the fundamental principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. While welcoming the elevated humanitarian efforts, we deem it necessary to point out that humanitarian assistance only offers temporary relief and is insufficient to protect civilians from harm. Humanitarian assistance cannot substitute the requirement for a comprehensive and lasting resolution of the conflict. We therefore reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to immediately and unconditionally cease its aggression against Ukraine, consistent with the rules of international law and the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, and to seek a resolution of its concerns through diplomacy and dialogue. Yesterday's Polish missile incident and the experience of history reminds us of the risks that the continuation of this unnecessary war poses in its further spread. The scenes from the city of Kherson are telling signs of how much the people desire an end to the war, an end to the strife, and the beginning of a new chapter of peace, reconciliation, and reconstruction. The Council must therefore support all efforts for peace. I thank you. I resume my function as the President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Under Secretary General DiCarlo. I thank Under Secretary Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. I'm sure it is difficult, if not painful, to deliver such a tragic account of the situation on the ground. I'm also profoundly thankful to our friend and colleague, U.S. Permanent Representative Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, for sharing her personal experience of meeting some of the victims of Russian war crimes in Ukraine. We believe every member of this Council ought to visit Ukraine. You are all welcome, all but Russia, that must immediately leave Ukraine and stop this carnage and stop making a cannon fodder production line of its own people. I also recognize here the representative of the terrorist Russian regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. What a mockery of peace efforts that terrorists are still at the table on an equal footing with 14 members of the Security Council, one day after the gravest attack on Ukraine's critical infrastructure. While temperatures in Ukraine start dropping below freezing, these terrorists aim to deprive Ukrainians of electricity, water, and heating. More than 90 missiles targeted energy facilities and other civilian infrastructure in and at least 11 regions of Ukraine. As a result, about 10 million Ukrainians throughout the country were affected by emergency blackouts. Ukraine expresses its solidarity with brotherly Polish people following yesterday's tragedy in the village of Przewódów, where 2 people were killed by missiles. We support a full and transparent investigation to establish all the facts of this tragic incident, and we are ready to cooperate with the Polish side to contribute to this investigation. At the same time, it is clear that the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, with regular missile terror as one of its core elements, remains the only root cause of violence and human suffering in Ukraine and beyond. As soon as Russia is unable to continue its war, security in the region will immediately be restored. Now Ukraine defends itself from barbaric attacks by Russia that aim to deprive millions of people of access to their basic needs and thus creating a humanitarian disaster that could spill over far beyond my country. We are grateful for the support of our friends, in particular Poland, in countering these attacks and bringing peace and security back to our region. Mr. President, Russia commits its nasty attacks against civilians because it is the only kind of revenge it can take for its regular military and diplomatic defeats. Last week, Ukraine restored its sovereignty over 4,500 square kilometers in Kherson and Mykolaiv region. Russian forces were kicked out of the only regional center they had been able to occupy since the beginning of the invasion. You might have seen the touching pictures of how the local people who spent 8 months under occupation and endured heavy suffering at the hands of the Russians greeted their liberators on the streets of Kherson and other deoccupied settlements. 8 months ago, when the Russian occupying forces entered Kherson, its residents were on the streets as well. The atmosphere was totally different, but there were some similarities with the joyful rallies in November. The Russian occupiers were also met with Ukrainian flags, the Ukrainian anthem, and the slogan, "Kherson is Ukraine." It is a matter of sadness that many did not live to see the deoccupation. Fleeing from the right bank of the Dnieper River, the Russian army left behind traces of the same atrocities that it committed in other regions. Investigators have already documented more than 400 Russian war crimes, and the bodies of both civilians and military personnel have been found. There is nothing for Russian diplomacy to boast about either. Perhaps accepting the sprinting skills that Putin's representative regularly develops by promptly fleeing from this chamber, and I appreciate that he is here today. Russian diplomacy did not and could not find any credible argument in response to the adoption by the General Assembly of the resolution for furtherance of remedy and reparation for aggression against Ukraine. We welcome this adoption, which is a clear message of hope for justice and an important first step towards accountability. President, recently we have heard a number of statements from the Russian side on negotiations and dialogue. One can hardly comment on the sincerity of these statements against the backdrop of 9 dozen missiles shelled on civilian infrastructure in one day. If there is no concrete action to restore peace, it means that Russia simply wants to deceive all of us again. Russia wants to buy time, build up its forces, and then launch another wave of aggression, terror, and global destabilization. We must not allow Russia to recharge. It is time to stop the war before the situation finally spirals in a menacing direction, unpredictable and uncontrolled. We must not allow Russia to recharge, as I said, but we also have to remember what President Zelensky outlined while addressing the G19 summit. Radiation and nuclear safety should be the first to be ensured. Russia must immediately withdraw all its militants from the territory of the Zaporizhzhia NPP. The station must be immediately transferred to the control of the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Ukrainian personnel. Second, food security should also be in the focus. Due to the strong participation of the UN, Turkey, and other partners, we have been able to improve food security globally. Since July, Ukraine has exported over 10 million tons of foodstuffs by sea. In order to increase our export by several million tons per month, Ukraine proposes to expand the grain export initiative to other ports, in particular, the port of Mykolaiv and Olvia in the Mykolaiv region. Ukraine has also launched the Grain from Ukraine initiative to support the most vulnerable. The first ship with 27,000 tons of wheat leaves for Ethiopia. Ethiopia that continues to vote against Ukraine. Nevertheless, we ship our grain to Ethiopia. Ukraine can export 45 million tons of foodstuff this year. Any country can join and contribute to ensuring the Ukrainian grain be supplied to those in need. and let a significant part of it be directed to those who suffer the most. Third is energy security. The Russian terror against Ukrainian energy infrastructure aims as well to prevent the export of our electricity to neighboring countries. While Russia is interested in energy crisis, we should all be interested in ending terror. I thank all our partners who have already helped Ukraine with the supply of air defense and missile defense systems. They work, but we need more to ensure full protection from Russian terrorists. We are ready to accept a mission of UN experts to the objects of critical energy infrastructure of Ukraine to assess the scale of damage and the needs for restoration, as well as to prevent their further destruction. The fourth critical step is the release of all prisoners and deportees. Thousands of our people, military and civilians, are in Russian captivity. They are subjected to brutal torture. Russia also continues to hold at least 11,000 children who have been forcibly deported to Russia. The only viable solution will be the release of prisoners on an all-for-all basis. Fifth, the principles of the UN Charter must be fully respected. Ukraine will not be ready to compromise its sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Six, Russian troops must be withdrawn from the territory of Ukraine, and Ukraine's control over all sections of our state border with Russia must be restored. This will result in a real and complete cessation of hostilities. Seventh, justice should immediately come next. Everywhere, when we liberate our land, we see one thing: Russia leaves behind torture chambers and mass burials of murdered people. This was the case in Bucha and other cities in the north of the country after their occupation. This was the case in the Kharkiv region. The same we observe now in the Kherson region. Eighth is the need to immediately protect the environment. Millions of hectares of forest were burned by shelling. Almost 200,000 hectares of our land are contaminated with unexploded mines and shells. Dozens of coal mines are flooded. Therefore, at the climate change conference held recently in Egypt, Ukraine proposed to create a platform to assess the environmental damage of war. The ninth step is to prevent escalation. Ukraine requires effective security assurances, which should be an integral element of the post-war security architecture in the Euro-Atlantic space. These guarantees could be formalized in the Kyiv Security Compact. The draft of this document has been already elaborated by Ukraine. And the final step will be a confirmation of the end of the war, when all the anti-war measures are implemented, when security and justice begin to be restored. A document confirming the end of the war should be signed by the parties. President, it seems that since our meetings in October, Russia has leveled up in defining its enemies in this war. Last time, as you remember, there were more war mosquitoes and birds. As we found out recently, Russia now tries, I quote, to stop the supreme ruler of hell, whatever the name he uses, Satan, Lucifer, or Iblis. In this fight, Russian enemies are backed by Westerners who have, I quote, saliva running down their chins from degeneracy, end of quote. Who do you think these quotations belong to? An inebriated person? A narrow-minded fan of Nazi ideas of superior or degenerative nations? In fact, it belongs to the former Russian president, Mr. Medvedev, now Putin's deputy in the Russian Security Council. I wonder why the Russian delegation refrained from delivering this important update to the Council. Or perhaps we should prepare for another urgent Council meeting as soon as Russia finds those who could brief the Council on how to exercise demands. It would be a logical continuation of both the Russian attempts to discredit the Security Council and the process of internal moral degradation of the Kremlin. Unfortunately, these morbid reflections have led to the deaths of tens of thousands in the bloodiest war in Europe since the Second World War. Russia must be stopped, and due to the courage of the Ukrainian army, due to the commitment of the Ukrainian people, due to the international solidarity with Ukraine, Russia will be stopped. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, allow me to start by providing the members of the Security Council with some additional details about yesterday's tragic event in Poland. On November 15, at around 3:30 p.m., during yet another wave of massive missile strikes by Russian forces against civilian critical infrastructure in the whole of Ukraine, including the immediate vicinity of the territory of Poland, 2 Polish citizens lost their lives in the Polish village of Przewodów, situated around 5 kilometers from the Polish-Ukrainian border. The apparent cause of their death was the explosion from the missile that fell on the location, which has no military background whatsoever. I would like to express our deepest gratitude for the gestures of solidarity also heard today that Poland keeps receiving from all over the world with regards to this tragic event. No matter what was the particular course of the events in Przewodów, that fatal afternoon, those innocent people would not have been killed if there had been no Russian war against Ukraine. Their only fault was the fact that they lived close to the civilian infrastructure on the Ukrainian side of the border that Russia keeps attacking as military targets. Mr. President, yesterday's sad events teaches us how close we actually live to a potential escalation and the spillover of the Russian war war of aggression of far-reaching consequences that we all can foresee. Bearing that in mind, Poland decided to act with full restraint and responsibility. We immediately launched an extensive, multifaceted investigation aimed at explaining all the details of the incident. The very initial findings support the hypothesis that the event was not a deliberate attack, but naturally we need to wait for the final conclusion until the investigation is over. Poland is also conducting the intensive consultations on the incident with its NATO allies and the key partners. A decision had to also be made to increase the combat readiness of the selected units of the Polish armed forces, with particular emphasis on airspace monitoring. We wish to assure the whole international community about the transparency of the ongoing investigation and about the guarantees of collective security which Poland will keep providing to the region, both as an individual country and as a part of the NATO, which remains the defensive alliance. We understand our responsibilities that lies in and that's why Poland is and will remain a regional stronghold of peace, security and stability. Mr. President, it is clear that it is Russia which is to blame for menacing the world with the war of aggression and its spillover effects, including yesterday's tragic incident in Poland. The launching of yesterday's missile attacks against Ukraine, the fiercest since the beginning of the war, required significant military preparations. Despite recent setbacks on the battlefield, Moscow clearly did not change its goals. It still wants to erase sovereign Ukraine from the map and cause innocent people to suffer. This evidently shows Russia's absolute lack of will to embark on the path leading to a resolution of the conflict that it has created. Russia pretends to be ready for talks, but in reality it's carrying its barbaric attacks against the civilian population and energy infrastructure of Ukraine. Distinguished member of the Security Council, the current situation will not change our approach. Poland believes it is crucial to continue the support for Ukraine. Poland has done so since the very beginning of the war. We approach it in the multidimensional way by providing aid both in Ukraine as well as within our own territory. We will continue on this path. Total estimated value of the Polish aid given in 2022 to Ukrainian refugees, both by individuals as well as the local and state authorities, amounts to over $5.5 billion, circa 1% of the Polish GDP. According to the OECD estimates in 2022, Poland will spend for humanitarian and military assistance the total of $8.5 billion. It's almost 1.5% of the Polish GDP, becoming one of the major donors to Ukraine. As we heard today, currently, the most urgent humanitarian issue that we'll need to focus is on the upcoming winter. Due to the Russian bombings, over 3.5 million people are left without a roof over their head. The priority is to create shelter for those people. The Russian forces continuously attack the Ukrainian energy infrastructure in a deliberate attempt to aggravate the humanitarian crisis. Their goal is probably also to cause another wave of refugees, which is calculated to destabilize the situation in the countries to which they arrive, including Poland. Mr. President, Russian imperialism needs to be treated as the thing it really is, a global threat with far-reaching consequences. This global threat needs to be neutralized before it plunges into the whole world further into chaos. This war needs to end with a just peace, the just peace. It needs to end on terms which are acceptable for Ukraine. The aggressor cannot benefit from its aggression. Instead, we need accountability for what atrocities and damages it is inflicted. Therefore, Poland welcomes the last week's General Assembly resolution on the creation of the Registry of Damages mechanism. We see it as a first step in the right direction. In conclusion, we once again call on all states which stands on the side of international law to take all necessary steps to persuade Russia to stop its aggression and to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. It is the only way to prevent further deaths, injuries, and devastations. This is the only way to stop escalation of this large-scale humanitarian and human rights crisis that continues to bring away lives of innocent civilians. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, I'm speaking on behalf of the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We thank the Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her most valuable briefing. Allow me to start by commending the immense bravery of the Ukrainian Defense Forces that last Friday, after months of Russian occupation, took back control of Kherson. There is no doubt that sooner or later, Ukraine will liberate all the occupied territories within its internationally recognized borders. These territories are Ukraine, and Ukraine has every right to defend them in full accordance with Article 51 of the Charter. We are steadfast in supporting Ukraine's efforts for as long as it takes, and will continue providing strong political, military, and financial support to Ukraine. Russian missiles hitting critical infrastructure and residential buildings in Kiev and in a number of other Ukrainian cities yesterday once again prove that Russia is not interested in peace. During the heaviest wave of missile strikes against Ukraine since February, 2 Polish citizens lost their lives in an explosion that took place in the east of Poland. Allow me to extend my deepest condolences to the families of all those who lost tragically their lives due to this barbaric attack. Notwithstanding ongoing investigations, it is clear that Russia alone bears the responsibility for the explosion as it continues its illegal war against Ukraine. We commend the swift actions by the UN humanitarian agencies led by the humanitarian coordinator, Dennis Brown, to bring humanitarian aid to Kherson on Monday for the first time since the Russian forces took control of Kherson. As in other liberated areas, the Russian army left Kherson with a trail of atrocity crimes. The city was left without water, heat, electricity, and communications. We urge Russia to give access to humanitarian organizations to areas currently under their occupation, so that necessary emergency assistance can reach all those in need in Ukraine. The winter is approaching fast in Ukraine, with the temperatures expected to fall well below freezing point. By using missiles and Iranian-supplied drones, Russia's deliberate strikes against Ukraine's energy facilities have left by now 7 million people without electricity. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are continuing to provide humanitarian aid to Ukraine to address the needs worsened by the winter and the Russian attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure, as well as demining assistance. We also urge Russia to give access to the UN representatives and the ICRC to the places of detention of civilians and prisoners of war, and ensure access of a UN fact-finding mission to Alenivka. The deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia is a war crime. Children belong to their families and loved ones, and they must be safely and immediately returned to their homes. Mr. President, the Russian unprovoked and brutal war of aggression against Ukraine has triggered issues of deep global concern. Due to Russia's blockade of Ukrainian seaports and the destruction of necessary infrastructure, Russia has caused a global food crisis and essentially weaponized food and hunger as means of hybrid warfare. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, alongside the EU-led Solidarity Lanes, has therefore been instrumental in stabilizing the global food market and providing food to millions of people in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Russia's statements claiming that Ukrainian grain is reaching only European countries and that its own grain and fertilizers shipments are prohibited by Western sanctions are fake, as we have heard the UN officials attest also in this council. We praise the UN Secretary General and Turkey for all the efforts to renew the grain deal, and we urge Russia to agree to the renewal of the initiative beyond November 19 and implement it in good faith. We strongly condemn Russia's irresponsible nuclear rhetoric and its cynical accusations against Ukraine of creating a dirty bomb. These accusations have been clearly and unequivocally refuted by the International Atomic Energy Agency. We urge Russia to immediately withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from the premises of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that Russia illegally controls and stop its nuclear blackmail. Finally, it is critical that all evidence of crimes and violations of human rights and international humanitarian law committed in Ukraine continue to be gathered in a manner that will hold up in independent, impartial judicial institutions. We are determined to ensure that all those responsible for war or other atrocity crimes must be held to account. But as has been said, the most responsible people are those who decided to wage this illegal war against Ukraine. The aggressor cannot go unpunished, or others will follow its lead. We therefore call for establishing a special tribunal to fill the current jurisdictional loophole and bring the Russia's top political and military leadership to justice for committing the crime of aggression against Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for convening us, and thank you for the opportunity to address the Council this afternoon. And thank you to Rosemary DiCarlo for a very comprehensive briefing. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, and I would like to highlight the following 3 points. One, the importance of upholding international humanitarian law. Secondly, on accountability for crimes committed in Ukraine. And thirdly, on the global consequences of Russia's war of aggression. First, Mr. President, on international humanitarian law. During the past weeks, Russia has stepped up its targeted strikes against Ukraine's civilians and civilian infrastructure. Yesterday saw the largest and gravest missile attack since the start of the invasion. We express our condolences to the families of the victims in both Ukraine and in Poland. By deliberately disrupting energy and water supply, Russia is trying to paralyze Ukraine and sow despair within the population as winter approaches. These unacceptable actions targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure by Russia are unlawful, and they constitute war crimes. The IMF estimates that Ukraine may need $4 billion a month just to keep the lights on and the taps running. We cannot leave the Ukrainian people in such a situation. The EU is therefore undertaking urgent rehabilitation measures to prepare for winter and repair the energy infrastructure bombed by Russia. We are also working on a package to ensure Ukraine's macroeconomic stability, maintaining essential public services, and rebuild critical infrastructure. I also reiterate the need for full humanitarian access, including in areas not currently under the Ukrainian government's control. My second point, Mr. Chairman, concerns accountability. The images from the liberation of Kherson bring both joy and dread. Joy, as the population welcomed its liberators after 8 months of brutal occupation. Dread, as stories and evidence of cruelty and war crimes surface, as they did in Bucha, Izium, and elsewhere. It is of paramount importance to continue documenting all evidence of war crimes committed throughout Ukraine. We rely on the International Criminal Court and on the Ukrainian authorities to bring perpetrators to account. We acknowledge Ukraine's efforts to secure accountability, including for the crime of aggression. We are accordingly examining the feasibility of various options in order to see how full accountability can be ensured in an optimal way. Monday's resolution by the General Assembly to recommend the creation of a register of damages and recognizing the need for reparation of damage is another important step to ensure accountability. All victims of Russia's aggression deserve justice and reparation. The EU will continue to support Ukraine in the framework of the ICJ proceedings, and we also highlight the important work of the Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council in this regard. Thirdly, Mr. President, on the global consequences. By weaponizing food in its war against Ukraine, Russia is solely responsible for the escalating global food security crisis. The EU is at the forefront of global efforts to address food insecurity, which is affecting millions of vulnerable people, especially in developing countries. We reiterate our strong support to all efforts to extend the UN-brokered Black Sea Grain Initiative and to scale up operations for the delivery of much-needed grain and other foodstuffs. We commend the work of the UN Secretary General and the Joint Coordination Center in Istanbul in this regard. According to UN data, 2/3 of the wheat exported from Ukraine through the Black Sea Grain Initiative has gone to developing countries. In addition to export overseas, through the EU-Ukraine Solidarity Lanes, 15 million tons of agricultural goods have been exported from Ukraine to global markets over land. To address capacity constraints and further facilitate export from Ukraine, the EU has mobilized an additional 250 million euros. In parallel, the EU is stepping up global food assistance. Earlier this week, a new humanitarian aid package of 210 million euros for 15 countries was announced, bringing the EU's overall food security support up to 8 billion euros between 2021 and 2024. We call on others to follow suit and step up their humanitarian assistance to the most vulnerable too. And I wanted to express here my appreciation and of the solidarity and some very good humanitarian gestures that have been announced by several members of this council, including some from very far away. Mr. President, President Zelensky stated earlier this week that his country is ready for peace. The EU supports all genuine and meaningful efforts to this end in full respect of international law, including Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We note, however, that Russia has not shown any indications it is engaging in serious and sincere diplomatic efforts. On the contrary, it has stepped up its missile attacks on civilian infrastructure. The EU will continue to stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes, and we continue to urge Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and unconditionally withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The war would end tomorrow if Russia withdraws as requested by the General Assembly. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Skok for his statement. And now give the floor to the representative of Slovakia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Slovakia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the distinguished representatives of the European Union. Mr. President, we are approaching 9 months since the beginning of the unprovoked and unjustified Russian military aggression against Ukraine in violations of all fundamental values and principles of the UN Charter and international law. Despite many calls of the international community, the Russian Federation remains silent and continues to justify its so-called special military operation under false pretext based on spreading disinformation and propaganda, which we strongly condemn. How can the Russian Federation continue to persuade us that its action is justifiable under international law? We have heard in last months in this very room from the Russian representatives how Ukrainian civilians were happy to see the Russian army allegedly liberating them from the Kiev influence. But recent pictures and videos of civilians greeting Ukrainian brave soldiers fighting for the future of their country with open arms in the newly liberated city of Kherson prove the exact opposite and only confirm that the Russian Federation has tried to persuade us about its kingdom of crooked mirrors perception. Slovakia remains to be gravely concerned about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which unfortunately progressively further deteriorates. We remain appalled by the huge numbers of killings of innocent civilians, attacks on critical infrastructure, as well as the huge scale of sexual and gender-based violence committed by Russian soldiers and occupants. We deplore in the strongest terms yesterday's Russian missile attacks across Ukraine, plunging 7 million homes into darkness. Mr. President, how can we expect that the Russian Federation adheres to the international law, humanitarian law including, and protects innocent civilians in time of war when it ignores to guarantee fundamental rights of its own citizens? We were horrified by the video with the execution of a former Russian prison inmate by a sledgehammer. Such an action is nothing else but arbitrary killing and multiple violation of human rights, including the right to life, and the proof that the human rights are for the Russian Federation nothing but a concept which it is deliberately ignoring. Mr. President, we would also like to reiterate our concerns over the serious effects of the Russian invasion on global food security. As a result, millions of people around the world are being pushed into extreme poverty, hunger, and lack of access to food. As the Black Sea Grain Initiative is about to expire, we strongly support its extension. Last but not least, Slovakia urges the Russian Federation to listen finally to the voice of the United Nations and implement all respective resolutions, including the resolution of the General Assembly adopted this Monday. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovakia for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.